We're on plan to defeat, destroy, disable all of their meaningful military capabilities.
The order came without warning. Inside the United States Military Command Center, alarms of urgency began spreading through the chain of command. Intelligence reports had confirmed the situation was escalating rapidly in the Middle East. Within minutes, a decision was made. The United States would deploy an additional 3,000 Marines to the region. Not tomorrow, not next week, immediately. Across multiple military bases, Marines who had already been placed on standby moved into action. On the flight lines, the distinctive silhouettes of V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft waited with engines warming. Rows of Marines stood beside them. Every soldier wore full combat gear. Body armor locked in place. Helmets secured. Rifles slung across their chests. Heavy backpacks filled with ammunition, survival gear, and mission equipment. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Everyone knew this deployment meant the situation overseas was serious. Then the signal came. The rear ramps of the Ospreys lowered. Marines moved quickly, boarding the aircraft in disciplined silence. Seat straps were tightened, weapons secured between their knees. Outside, the engines roared louder. The massive rotors began to tilt upward. One by one, the aircraft lifted off the runway and disappeared into the sky, heading toward U.S. naval ships already waiting in the region. The mission had begun, and this was only the first wave. Hours after takeoff, the first wave of Osprey aircraft reached their destination. Far below them, the dark surface of the ocean stretched endlessly. In the distance, massive U.S. naval ships waited like floating fortresses. These ships would become the forward staging platforms for the Marines before entering the Middle East. One by one, the Ospreys approached the flight decks. The aircraft descended carefully through the sea wind. Then, touchdown. The rear ramps dropped instantly. Marines stepped out quickly, moving across the deck in organized lines while deck crews guided them toward the ship's interior. Below deck, the atmosphere was tense and focused. Inside narrow briefing rooms, officers gathered the newly arrived Marines. The briefings were fast, no long speeches, only the essential information, mission objectives, operational zones, rules of engagement, emergency contingency plans. Every Marine listened carefully. Every detail mattered, because once they left this ship, they would be operating in one of the most volatile regions in the world. When the briefing ended, the preparation began immediately. Crates of ammunition were opened, magazines were filled round by round, rifles were inspected carefully, bolt actions checked, optics adjusted, sidearms were loaded and secured into holsters. Machine gun teams assembled their weapons piece by piece. Heavy barrels locked into place. Tripods unfolded. Belts of ammunition prepared. Around the ship, the sound of metal clicking, weapons locking, and equipment being checked echoed constantly. No one was idle. Every Marine had a task. Load ammunition, check gear, prepare weapons, because soon they would be leaving the safety of the ship and stepping into a combat zone. The desert landing zone appeared suddenly beneath the aircraft. Miles of empty land. No buildings, no roads. Only endless sand and heat. Inside the Osprey, Marines tightened their grips on their rifles as the aircraft began its descent. Dust started swirling across the ground. Then, the aircraft touched down. The rear ramp slammed open. Marines rushed out immediately, spreading out across the landing zone while the aircraft engines thundered behind them. Within minutes, the aircraft lifted off again, leaving the first group of Marines standing alone in the desert. Their mission was clear. They had to build a forward operating base from nothing. The unloading began immediately. Supply crates were pulled from the aircraft. Backpacks dropped. Equipment scattered across the sand. The first structure to go up was camouflage protection. Long camouflage nets were stretched across metal poles and anchored into the ground, breaking up the visual outline of the camp from enemy drones and surveillance aircraft. Next came the shelters. Canvas tarps were unfolded and tied to metal frames, creating shade and protection from the brutal desert sun. But the most important work came next. Digging. Marine teams grabbed shovels and began carving fighting positions into the hard desert soil. Defensive fighting holes, observation posts, protective berms. Sandbags were filled and stacked into walls around the perimeter of the camp. Machine gun positions were placed at strategic angles to cover every direction of approach. Fields of fire were cleared. No blind spots, no weak points. Then came communications. Portable antennas were raised high above the camp, and radio operators established secure links with command ships offshore. Within just a few hours, the empty desert had transformed. What had once been open sand was now a fully operational forward military camp. Defensive positions, command tents, communication lines, weapon emplacements, and more Marines were already on their way, because this base was only the beginning. Back on the naval ships, preparation never stopped. While the 1st Marines were establishing the desert base, the rest of the units continued training at sea. On the upper deck of the ship, live fire drills were underway. Targets were placed along the far edge of the deck. One Marine stepped forward, rifle raised. He took a breath. Then, bang! The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the open ocean. One after another, Marines rotated through the firing line. Each soldier practiced combat marksmanship. Short bursts, controlled breathing, precise trigger control. They weren't just firing randomly. Every shot had a purpose. Every movement simulated the conditions they would face on the ground. Between firing rotations, Marines worked on their weapons. Optics were adjusted. Scopes were zeroed for different distances. Each sights were calibrated carefully to ensure accuracy in the desert environment, where engagements could happen hundreds of meters away. Nearby, another group of Marines sat on the deck floor loading magazines. Rounds were pressed down into magazines one by one. Dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands. A constant cycle of preparation continued across the ship. One team firing, one team loading ammunition, another team cleaning rifles and checking equipment. Machine gun teams practiced assembling and disassembling their weapons at speed. Every Marine understood the reality. Soon they would leave the ship, soon they would enter the combat zone. And when that moment came, their training had to be perfect. While Marines prepared at sea and established the desert camp, another critical operation was unfolding thousands of miles away. The military logistics network had already been activated. At major U.S. military bases, the pace of activity had reached full intensity. Across massive airfields, forklifts and cargo loaders moved constantly across the concrete tarmac. There was no pause, no slowdown. The mission was simple: move everything needed for war. Heavy transport aircraft waited on the runway with their rear cargo ramps lowered. These enormous aircraft would carry the equipment that Marines would soon depend on in the field. One by one, armored vehicles were driven toward the aircraft. Massive military trucks, light tactical vehicles, armored patrol transports. Each vehicle slowly climbed the cargo ramps before being chained securely to the floor of the aircraft's cargo bay. Behind the vehicles came the supplies: pallets stacked with crates of rifle ammunition, boxes filled with mortar shells, grenades packed tightly into military containers, anti-tank missiles carefully secured in reinforced crates. But weapons were only part of the cargo. War required everything else too: food supplies, water containers, medical equipment, spare vehicle parts, fuel bladders, portable generators, communication systems. Everything Marines would need to survive and operate in the harsh desert environment was loaded into the aircraft. The cargo bays filled quickly. Once the loading crews secured the final straps and locking chains, the aircraft doors were sealed. Engines roared to life, while the massive transport aircraft slowly rolled toward the runway. Then, they lifted into the sky, heading toward the Middle East. And as one aircraft departed, another immediately moved into position to be loaded. The supply chain was now fully active. Operating around the clock, because when the Marines arrived on the battlefield, everything they needed would already be waiting. Back in the Middle East, the desert base continued to grow. The first group of Marines had already transformed the empty sand into a functioning forward camp. But that was only the beginning. More aircraft were coming. One after another, transport planes and Osprey aircraft appeared over the horizon. The sound of engines echoed across the desert sky. Each landing brought more Marines, more equipment, more vehicles. As the aircraft touched down, the camp burst into activity again. Cargo ramps dropped open. Marines rushed forward to unload the supplies. Armored vehicles rolled down the ramps. Pallets of ammunition were stacked in secure storage areas. Fuel containers were placed near vehicle lines. Generators were started to power communication systems and lighting equipment. Within hours, even the small temporary camp had expanded into something far larger. Rows of tents appeared across the sand. Vehicle staging areas were marked out. Defensive sandbag walls were reinforced and extended around the perimeter. Machine gun positions were strengthened. Observation towers were assembled. Radar and communication antennas rose high above the base. From above what had once been a blank stretch of desert now looked like a fully operational military installation. Command posts, supply depots, vehicle compounds, living quarters. And at the center of it all, officers studied maps and satellite images inside the command tent. Because the base was not the final objective. It was only the staging ground. Something bigger was coming. A large-scale operation was beginning to take shape, and thousands of Marines were now in position, waiting for the next order. As night fell over the desert, the atmosphere inside the forward base changed. The burning heat of the day slowly faded, replaced by the cold silence of the desert night. But inside the base, the activity never stopped. Floodlights illuminated the camp. Long shadows stretched across the sand as Marines moved between tents, vehicles, and defensive positions. Some soldiers sat quietly outside their tents, rifles resting beside them. Others continued checking their equipment one more time. Magazines were loaded, radios tested, night vision goggles adjusted. Every Marine knew something important was about to happen. Inside the command tent, officers gathered around large maps and digital displays. Satellite images showed the surrounding terrain. Routes were studied. Objectives were confirmed. Final orders were being prepared. Outside, the deep rumble of helicopter engines began to echo across the base. Transport helicopters sat on the edge of the camp with their rotors slowly spinning. Crew chiefs moved between the aircraft performing final inspections. Nearby, armored vehicles lined up in formation. Engines idling, drivers waiting for the signal. The entire base felt like it was holding its breath, waiting, because once the order was given, everything would move at once. Helicopters would lift into the night sky. Convoys would roll across the desert, and thousands of Marines would move toward their mission. For now, there was only one thing left to do: wait for the command.